Last week I started improving my experimental donut website. This has helped me to get more comfortable with the fundamentals of React again, and to get a better feeling for the basics of Three.js. I have been reading through some of the React 3 documentation to see what I can do and have gotten a few ideas which I immediately try to implement. Since I followed the Blender tutorial to create the donut, I also created a simple animation which I wanted to play when the user clicks the donut. Fortunately, this was way easier than I thought. The code I generated based on the model already had some hooks implemented, which took care of the most part. I'm using the useGLTF hook from the React 3 package, which uses the useLoader hook and the GLTF loader internally to load the donut model. In order to actually play back the animation, I need to use an animation mixer, and to do this, I easily can use the useAnimations hook, which abstracts away the animation mixer. Then I can use the destructured actions variable from the object that the hook returned to work with the animation. As I wanted to play the animation sequence when the user clicked on the model, I had to create an onClick function, which I added on the whole group of the model. In hindsight, I probably should have added it on the mesh instead, but it worked either way. In theory, it is pretty easy to play the animation. The actions variable has both the play and the stop function, and it technically worked perfectly. I created an animation state to check if I should start or stop the animation, and updated the variable respectively. The only catch was that the stop function completely reset the animation, which means the donut suddenly jumped back to its starting position. This was fine for now, but I really wanted to find a solution where the animation would just stop where it was and continue from there when the user clicked again. Next, I wanted to let the donut follow the mouse movements of the user to make the whole site feel a bit more alive. This was actually pretty easy to achieve with some simple math and the useFrame hook. As the name suggests, the useFrame hook is called every frame, which is perfect to implement effects like this. It takes in a callback function which receives a state containing a lot of useful data, such as the mouse position, which is perfect for what I want to do. First of all, I calculated the x and y coordinates based on the mouse position and the viewport dimensions and divided it by a number that basically represents how sensitive the effect is. Then I just used the handy lookat function from the reference I initialized earlier and wrapped the code inside an if statement, because it should only follow the mouse when the animation is inactive. After getting the small mouse feature working, I went back to trying to solve my animation problem. After almost an hour of trial and error and reading the documentation, I finally found the setEffectiveTimescale function. To understand why the stop function was not working in the first place, I want to explain this in a bit more detail. When working with an animation action instance, you have to know it has a few properties to keep track of the current state of the animation. For instance, if you call isRunning on an action, a few conditions must be met for the function to return true. Paused must be equal to false, enabled must be equal to true, timescale is not 0, and there is no scheduling delayed for a start. The latter was not important in this case. So what happens when you call the stop function? The animation will be immediately stopped and reset, and that means that paused is set to false, enabled is set to true, and timed to 0. This is why the animation suddenly jumps to its initial state, so I had to find another solution. This is where I found the setEffectiveTimescale function. As the name says, it lets me set the timescale of the animation, and to stop, or even better, to pause the animation, I just set the value to 0. It worked just as I wanted. The animation stopped exactly where it had been paused. Now the only issue was that I suddenly could not continue the animation. After debugging my code, I was even more confused, because everything was called as I expected. So back to reading the documentation. Turns out, calling the play function doesn't necessarily mean that the animation starts immediately. It is also bound to some conditions, and I quickly realized what the problem in my specific situation was. If you take a look at the documentation, you can see the timescale has to be 0 for the animation to start playing. And guess what I just did? Exactly, I set the timescale to 0. So for now my solution is that I just set the timescale to 1 right before the play function gets called. This definitely doesn't feel like the intended way, but it works for now. Now that I got some really basic stuff working, I wanted to have more possible interactions with the donut. And I've already seen a few examples where React Spring is getting used in combination with Three.js, so I wanted to try it out. The package comes with its own set of hooks and animated elements to make your life as easy as possible. The hook which I'll probably be using the most is useSpring. My idea is pretty simple. When the user hovers over the donut, it should get bigger, and when the cursor leaves the donut, it should return to its normal size. And React Spring actually makes this quite simple for you. First of all, I needed a way to detect if the user has hovered the donut. Well, the biggest problem was figuring out what the property was actually called, because there were like 3 different variants, but onPointerOver and onPointerOut finally worked for me. I quickly set up another state variable, which I just called active. Yeah, I know, the naming is so good, nobody who would read the code later would know why it even exists at first glance. In the onPointerOver function, I just call setActiveTrue, so you know the user is currently hovering over the donut. And in the onPointerOut function, I do the opposite and call setActiveFalse. With that out of the way, I could initialize the useSpringHook and change the scale property depending on the active state. Now I only had to switch the mesh element with an animated mesh element. That's coming with the Spring package, and everything worked as intended. In the meantime, I also moved the logic to start and pause animation from the onClick function to the hover logic, because it felt way smoother this way. My last accomplishment for this week was that I wanted to add some more color to the whole site, instead of this boring black background. I found a nice example on the React Spring documentation for changing background color with async CSS variables. This was probably way more complicated than it had to be, but it was a nice little challenge to get it working. So how did I do it? In the app component, where I currently implement my donut component, I pasted the code for the Spring background animation. I added some variables in the CSS files, and the animation part should be working. Now I only needed to figure out a way to know when the user was hovering over the donut to change the style of the root div element to this animated background. Well, my solution was quite simple. I once again created a new state variable in the app component, and for some reason I decided to name it properly this time. Well, still not perfect, but better. And then I implemented a callback function in the donut component, which I just called onHover. And I would pass it true if it was called in the onPointerOver function or false in the onPointerOut function. Looking at this now, the code definitely needs some refactoring, but I'll do that later. Back in the app component, I just had to call setIsHovering in the callback function. And now I could make the final changes to the root div. Since it should be animating, I also needed to change it to an animated div element. And finally, I only had to add this line as an attribute, which just checks if isHovering is true and then adds the background as a style, or null if it's false. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate if you liked and subscribed if you enjoyed this video. See ya!